topic that includes some of what Muhammad actually talked about today. It's called "We Will Shoot Back Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement." We will shoot back armed resistance in Mississippi Freedom Movement. And furthermore, I've been an activist. I'll be 62 next week. I've been an activist since I was 18. The first thing I got actually seriously involved in was the Defense Committee for Muhammad when he was captured in 1972. And I'm also a founding member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement and the New African People's Organization, along with one of Detroit's best sons, Chokwe Lumumba. And in his spirit, I want to say, free the land. 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 By any means necessary, I shade. But I'm really honored to be here today on a lot of levels. Number one, I'm honored to be here and to spend time with John. I actually met John before in New Orleans, but I spent more time talking to his mother, who was there with him. And I think he wanted it that way. He wanted to have his mother as a spokesperson for the family at that time. But I got to meet him earlier today and feel his spirit. And it leads me to one thing. My years in the movement, one of the slogans we had, that still is a part of the collective I belong to, is Black family is a unit of struggle. So when you talk about, you can't talk about Robert Williams. I always tell my students, but I talk about Mabel Williams. Because if you talk about Robert Williams, you talk about armed self-defense. She was a part of that, right? You see the picture. It's not just him, Robert with the gun, it's Mabel with the gun, right? And you can't talk about Radio Free Dixie. You see the images, she right there alone producing with him, right? You can't talk about the Crusader. Not only without talking about Mabel, but Muhammad mentioned Ethel Azalea Johnson, right? So there were Black women who were involved in that process. So it's a unit of struggle. But then I found out from listening to John today that it carries from one generation to the next. And so I'm just really moved at the spirit that I learned about as a teenager, Robert Williams, continues. Now, I just want to mention a few things, so then we can get to dialogue. But when we think about the Crusader, it's been mentioned by others here that Robert and Mabel were part of a network. They helped establish a network. And just looking at the Crusader, you see it branched and began to bring several groups of people together. We talked about this, and this was something that helped promote this whole movement around self-defense that has been referred to. And I agree with Muhammad. There were already people in the South practicing armed self-defense. The thing that distinguishes Robert is he's an advocate. Most people were practicing it quietly. You know, people who were not only veterans, but part of logics. You know, people who were members of the same church. It were more like informal associations and networks that Black folks had in their communities to protect and defend themselves. But they were quiet. They didn't talk about it. Robert Williams was a vocal advocate in the 1957 movement in developing Monroe. The Crusader became the vehicle to talk about it to folks, right? And so you have here in Detroit people like, that was mentioned before, Grace and James Boggs. They're part of that network to defend and support that movement, right? And you go to New York, Queen Mother Ollie Moore. She's is the modern day mother of our reparations movement. She's promoting the Crusader and supporting the movement. Muhammad already talked about Malcolm, and I don't know if everybody gets the significance of what he's talking about. In the temple of the Nation of Islam, you know, they didn't do that, right? So this is something exceptional for the Nation of Islam to do at that particular time, is to support that. But I think it's based upon two things. At that particular time in our history, all of our folks looked at the South, right? We looked at the South as the home. You know, even when we had a homecomings for church, people would look toward the South. And so that was something, I think, on the other end, if you look at Montgomery, people identify with the Montgomery movement and help bring us together. Muhammad talks about that in his book. And so I think that was part of the thing, our national consciousness leaning south. So we were Muslim, Christian, Marxist. People began to look at that movement of Robert and Mabel and others talk about defending ourselves. But besides them, you also had people like John Henry Clark, who began to organize again around the Crusader and get money, not just to support the movement there, but what? Buy guns, ammunition. In fact, it said that John Henry Clark and John Oliver Killings, the great poet, driving to Monroe to deliver guns and ammunition to folks down there. So this is a large movement. It even goes beyond black folks, because you had people in left organizations like the Workers' World Party, I learned this from Muhammad, and the Socialist Workers' Party, who raised money to support. And even after Robert was forced into exile, were part of the defense network for the Crusader, for the Monroe defendants. So I agree with what the previous speakers have said. This is an under-recognized part of our movement that initiated and brought different forces together around this whole concept of self-defense. And I think it's important that if you look at a group that hadn't been mentioned today that came out of this city, Uhuru, part of their inspiration and part of what pulls them together to work with Muhammad and John and young people in California, some of my mentors who published a journal called Soul Book. What pulls them all together in this network became called RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement, which was the first group to promote this concept of what we call revolutionary nationalism. It's pulled together through Robert in support of this armed self-defense movement. And so I think that's an important part of our struggle. Let me close with this. As I mentioned, I wrote the book, We Will Shoot Back. And after the recent events, particularly in Dallas, someone called me and asked me to write an article, particularly after the group was arrested down there, that they thought, you remember when the police officers was shot initially, they arrested this brother who was openly carrying a rifle. And so I wrote a response to it, and I basically talked about how it's a challenge in America, because on the one hand, they promote right to bear arms for white people, but when black people carry guns, it becomes a dilemma, right? And so it becomes a dilemma. And so one of the things I called for was, as I mentioned, in the 60s, in the 50s, because our communities were more cohesive, then we had more of a consciousness of watching each other's back. So self-defense was already practiced. And I argued that, one of the things my wife pointed out to me one time, we were in a conversation when the Martin trial was going on. And my wife talked about how Trayvon Martin was on the phone with his friend Rachel. And he said, I'll just say what he said. He said, this creepy ass cracker is following me. And my wife always said, wouldn't it have been different if Trayvon could have called his, or told Rachel, call my daddy. And then the network was mobilized, and you know, it would have been a whole different thing with Zimmerman that night, right? You know, so so my thing was, I made an appeal to our community that we need to have a consciousness of watching each other's back. But here's the funny thing, the person that asked me to write the blog, they were scared to publish it, because they said, Akinyele, it sounds like you're telling black people to arm themselves. I said, black people are already armed. The problem is the lack of consciousness and cohesiveness in our community. We saw Robert talk about the influx of drugs into our community. That's brought all types of guns that wasn't even around during the time we're talking about, right? There's all type of armament in our community. But what's lacking is the type of network. So when we look at the Williams family as I said, a family that was a unit of struggle, we need to reunite our communities, reunite our families to build that community consciousness and cohesiveness. In spite of all this damn gentrification I see here in Detroit and others of our cities, you know, that's used to disperse us, right? So we got to be intentional about building community, building family, building networks, building our neighborhoods, building cooperative collectives to resist this gentrification that's going on. And part of studying what happened in Monroe and Robert Williams and Mabel Williams and the Williams family will be a way we can help counter it for the new generation. Thank y'all. Free the land.